Could you go into a bit more depth about Ron Wright's rivalry with the late Whitey Caldwell?
Ron Wright and Whitey Caldwell started as young men. Back in the 50s, there actually was a pro-am division of the local professional wrestling cards, where there would be a couple of pro matches featuring the names that, you saw on television, the local TV, and or the names that people knew. But they would let some of the guys that were like at the local Kingsport Boys Club that were wrestlers, they would have them have an actual match on the show, because it was back in the days, especially in East Tennessee, where credibility was everything. And if people didn't believe, that's what killed Knoxville the first time. We've talked about it in the late 70s when Ronnie Garvin, Bob Roop, Bob Orton, Boris Malenko split off from the Fullers Southeastern Wrestling. It got in the papers that the business was a work, and this was in the late 70s and killed the territory. But back in the 50s, Ron and Whitey both started wrestling at the local Kingsport Boys Club as amateurs. And then they graduated to a couple of matches on the pro cards, and then they were broken in. And when I did the Night of Legends event in Knoxville and went back and got some of the old newspaper clippings and things for the history pieces that we did, Ron Wright and Whitey Caldwell main evented the wrestling shows in Kingsport, Tennessee, and in Johnson City and all over East Tennessee in 1957, 1958, 1962, 1964, 1966, and then up until 1972, they were still main eventing against each other when Whitey was killed in the car wreck. And it's a legendary story that the following week in Knoxville, Whitey had been booked. And gosh, I wish I could remember the exact match, but I believe I can't remember who the heels were, but Whitey had been booked with another babyface to team up against two heels that had some heat in the territory at the time. And Ron came out and said, in honor and in memory of Whitey Caldwell, I will take his place, teaming up with such and such babyface against these two heels. And they sold the son of a gun out. Because Ron had never been a babyface, at least as far as I know before. And just because the people knew, even though they still believed the wrestling business, they knew that these guys that had fought in all these wars, in these Tennessee chain matches, and they'd done these hard ways, and they'd busted each other open, and they'd spilled their blood in every town in East Tennessee for a 15-year period, they knew that ultimately they respected each other. Ron respected Whitey, and Whitey respected Ron, and it was such a touching thing, and it made such local news that the biggest wrestling star in the history of East Tennessee and most popular had been killed in a car wreck. And I mean, these guys, the newspaper, and I have these clippings, the newspaper would print the results of the matches, whether it be in Chilhowie Park in Knoxville on Friday night or at the Kingsport Civic Auditorium or whatever, and they would just use their first names in the headline. Ron beats Whitey again. And everybody knew who it was. And they did such angles where Whitey beat Ron and won Ron's Tennessee walking horse that had won prizes in competition. And the other one would have to, the chain matches where they'd be chained together left wrist to left wrist, and they would beat each other up for real and bloody. Kevin Sullivan talked about it when. So
quite literal chain wrestling. Quite literal chain wrestling.
Chain wrestling, yes. Anyway, Ron Wright and Whitey Caldwell were in effect, the Midnight Express and Rock and Roll Express of their era, where they were the yin and yang. No matter what happened, no matter what promotional changes took place in the territory, no matter what other talent came in and left, there was the story where Dory Funk Jr. came in to defend the NWA World Championship in the early 70s against the top babyface in East Tennessee that happened to be Whitey Caldwell. When he got there and was in the locker room, and he said, "Who am I wrestling?" Because back then the champion he got into town. He didn't know who he's booked with. And they said, "Whitey over there." And Whitey Caldwell was like 5'9" and 190 and had the truck driver tan. And Dory thought they were ribbing him. And so he waited and said, "Well, let's see, when this rib's going to be over with." And nobody ever told him anything different. And when the bell rang for their match there, Whitey got up and went to the ring. And Dory said, "I guess I'm going to wrestle this guy." And they went an hour Broadway. and Dory put him over for his ability. He was realistic. He was credible. But local legend goes, Dory may not like to say this, but after the fact, the match actually hurt business in the town because everybody knew that there wasn't a man alive that could go an hour with Whitey Caldwell. So Ron and Whitey were inextricably linked with each other in that it's a very isolated part of the country. You can imagine what it was like in the 50s and 60s, and they liked their wrestling believable. That's why there were so many hard ways done and so much blood spilled, and the work was tight. It wasn't pretty, but it was tight and it was believable. It looked, the only thing different than a Ron Wright and Whitey Caldwell wrestling match and a fight at a local bar was they didn't have any bottles in the ring at the time. Otherwise it looked basically the same. So, these guys were pioneers, and for the place they were and the time they were perfect for that environment. And they carried the pro wrestling business in East Tennessee on their backs for 15 years.
Goodness gracious. I mean, like a bar fight, that just sounds so rough and crazy. You will really never see anything quite like that anymore that I can think of.
And there's no video. Let's say there's very little. There's a couple of pieces, snippets of 8mm film of Ron and Whitey, and you don't really get a chance to, and it's dark, of course, and you don't get a chance to really get the whole flavor. But from people who were eyewitnesses, basically there was nothing to distinguish their matches. And part of it, I'm sure, had to do with the strength of their personalities and Ron's incredible promo and Whitey's charisma just as a likable guy. But people swear that those matches, to this day, when I was talking to people in the 90s, the mid 90s, that when I lived there and ran Smoky Mountain Wrestling, people oftentimes would come up to me and say, well, wrestling's all showbiz these days, but when Whitey and Ron fought, it was for real.
I have no idea why I just paused like that. I'll edit that out.
Well, don't it. I mean, what can you say?
There's really not much you can say.
It's, it was a tribute to those guys. And I mean, the pictures I've seen Ron Wright's photo album where his eye was swollen shut and the stitches he had in his face, that's the extent that they went to protect their business and to make sure that and who else in an area that geographically small with absolutely no major population centers, going back for weekly matches in all these small towns in eastern Kentucky with the coal miners and the people who, they had a pretty rough life as it was. And these two guys were able for 15 years to draw money on top and make people believe that what they were doing was real. You don't see that anymore. You're never going to see it again. And that's why Ron Wright had such incredible heat to the point he was stabbed. He was shot at. We talked about the story where they burned his plane. I've seen the pictures of the plane burned to the ground at the little airport they had in Harlan. He would fly a single engine plane up to those eastern Kentucky mountain towns. And the fans one night beat him back to the airfield, I should say. It wasn't even an airport. A lot of times Ronnie Garvin would do the same thing. He'd fly his plane to a farmer's field, and the farmer would put the cows up, and he'd stand there with a big flashlight at the edge of the trees so Ronnie knew when to get over the top of the trees. And Ron did the same thing, Ron Wright did, and they burned his plane. Ron Wright had more heat as a heel per capita than possibly any other heel in wrestling history. And the dangerous places that they went, it was a whole nother world back then. And at the same time, Whitey Caldwell was so popular. We told this story, bears repeating, still brings goosebumps. We had Whitey's widow, Nancy, come to the Coliseum at Night of Legends to present her the award for the most popular wrestler in the history of Knoxville wrestling. And at that point in time, and that was 22 years after his death, people still went to the cemetery where Whitey Caldwell was buried and put flowers on his grave.